So now we're going to start with what's in the program as a master class, which is a term that I really don't like in general, but I think for this particular thing that we're doing in the cost action, it's especially inappropriate because slow memory is really not, an established theory, and I'm going to tell you what's the right way to apply it, but rather it's, I would say, a research program, right? It's a set of sensibilities or assumptions and interests that we're working on jointly together, and I think that will allow us to collaborate and to sort of build on each other's work or insights. Right? And having read a bunch of your papers, I think that's even more true, right, than I thought before I read them. So, there's so much interesting stuff in there. And so you'll see, I think, through the next few days that people have very different access points to the slow memory issue or the research program, but we probably have a lot of overlapping concerns, I would say. And I want to try and talk about that today. So I think what will come out is a little bit the things that we've been talking about over the last few years in the action. And of course, it'll be shaped by my own research and my own perspective on things. I'm a political scientist, right? So I'm mostly interested in memory politics, and that's my perspective on it, which doesn't mean that you can't have a different take on it. So how do I, there we go. Right, so again, I just wanted to emphasize at the outset that the cost action has really been kind of a breeding ground for these lots of diverse kinds of research, right? We have all these different working groups, so different foci, but I think we're united by sort of our interest in temporality, in uneven and gradual transformations, and in also a commitment to social and political and environmental engagement, right? There's something in the action that is very much not neutral, and I would, there's a concept by Christoph Mauch, who's a German historian, called slow hope, which I really like because it's kind of about, especially when you talk about the environment, it's easy to get desperate and hopeless, right? And it's important to talk about these issues in a way that doesn't make us hopeless and that still kind of thinks about, where's the hope and where can we make a difference. So the other thing I wanted to emphasize at the outset is that, the idea of slowness means different things to different people, right? So depending on your access, what you're studying, the time span that, or the activity that you're thinking about as slow, whatever that means in your definition, can be very different. And if you compare, for example, those of us, for example, in the environmental working group, where we're often thinking about deep time, geological time, comparing that to maybe a 20-year time span of dealing with a relatively recent conflict, right? That would be nothing for somebody thinking about geological time. So it's not about defining, a neutral or universally applicable definition of slowness. It's about a certain sensitivity to time, to how time feels to people, how we construct time, and how it shapes our relationships with the past and our practices of remembering. If you haven't checked out our working papers, this is just a screenshot of the working papers that are already up on our website. I would encourage you to check them out because that'll give you a good idea of some different approaches that people have used. So just to start us off, we have kind of tried to think about slow memory, just to sort of structure it for ourselves as a few different entangled realms. The first is that we're thinking about the need for our theories of memory to be able to attend to slow things, or slow development, slow paths, right? And when I say slow, I don't just mean slow as a temporal adjective, but it's kind of a shorthand, right, for developments that are maybe don't have a clear beginning or end, that can be gradual, that are not spectacular, that maybe a lot of people don't see, that are maybe unsighted or multi-sighted, so difficult to place in one area, and that are seemingly agentless. Right? So obviously not necessarily as such, but just that are where there's distributed agency, for example. So it's not very scientific to say it like this, but it's hard to pin down developments that we're interested in, right? That have a profound impact on our lives. The second thing that we're interested in is, or that we want slow memory theory to do, is to help us understand memory practices that can happen at different tempos, and of course, especially the ones that we think of as slow, because they're forms of remembrance that are often not necessarily recognized by memory studies, conventional memory studies. And the third thing is doing memory studies differently, kind of slowing down our practices of working together and our methodologies, and doing things with less time pressure, which is very ironic, especially if we say this to Orly now, who's organized this conference. It's a bit of a joke that we have, a running joke that aren't our lives all really slow at the moment? We've not really succeeded in that. But that, I think the fact that, the cost action now has over 300 members, it's been really popular. It's quite big for a cost action. And I think part of the reason it's so popular is because people have this craving for, slowing down. And it's not just memory scholars, obviously everywhere, but especially in the academy, people are just, it's desperate. It's like, I don't have time to do things properly. And so the idea, not just that it's bad for us to study and to work that way, on a personal level, but also that it really makes it difficult to study the things that we care about in a way that makes sense, right? If we are always forced to do things and, we have to submit publications, we have to submit grants, we have to, show our deliverables, including in this action, is really difficult to do things in a way that really honors the things that we want to study. So that's, part of the reason we try to do these conferences a little bit differently with walks and different kinds of events. And if you're interested in that, you can also check out our podcast, which Taylor has very nicely put online now. You can subscribe to it so you automatically get the new episodes. And the first one is our manifesto. So that is the things we would love to do. Now, I think I'm gonna, because I'm a bit worried about time, I'm gonna skip over this because I think there's a lot of memory studies knowledge in the room. I don't need to go over the waves of memory studies, probably, but we can go into it more later if you like. So I'm just gonna skip to the next thing, which I think it's important to sort of be clear about the fact that slow memory as a research program is, of course, a product of its times. And it's a time where, including the things I just talked about in terms of our pressure for our research, it's a time that feels like it's accelerating constantly. And we're feeling that time pressure ourselves. So everything seems to be speeding up. And this is probably the most evident in the environmental arena, where there's more people than ever, more plastic than ever, more everything than ever, more acid in the oceans, whichever measure you look at, it just seems like things are going up like crazy. And so there are various reactions to that. One is that you have a sort of resistance to this acceleration. So you probably all know the slow movement, the slow food movement, and so forth. Which is a societal reaction to this acceleration. But there's also the flip side, this idea that this is amazing, right, and wonderful, and it's going to make us all happier if we just keep this race up. In the corporate world, there's a lot of that. So it's sort of triumphalist. But in the environmental field, there's an important book called The Great Acceleration, right, where the authors talk about this as defining the beginning of the Anthropocene, right? The sort of new geological age, even though scientists have now rejected the term, but we'll just gloss over that for now. So the idea is that humans are now the crucial geological force. And it means that millions of years from now, right, thinking about longue durée, so after we're all gone, humankind has disappeared, our actions will be visible in the rock layer, right, in the geological layers. And Deepesh Chakrabarty pointed out that this is kind of the first time where or at least a lot of us are now aware of this duality of time. So we have two present moments, present times that we're thinking about if we are sort of relatively aware of this environmental emergency, which is now a lived time, which has also always been a human history and so on. But at the same time, we're also becoming more aware of this biological, geological temporality. And I think obviously this is really clear in environmental matters, but I think that's kind of the sort of sensitivity that we're talking about that, in the slow memory research program, that we kind of know there's something else going on at another time scale that's not easy for us to grasp, and that we need to make an effort to incorporate that into our thinking. Now, this concern with speed and this sort of fear of speed is, of course, not very new, right? So modernity, right, when people started having bicycles, which are really super fast, and trains and things, this awareness is, maybe not something of our particular era, but you might argue that this concern with speed in modernity is something that helped shape the field of memory studies. So Pierre Nora, famously argued that we've moved from a time when we have milieu de mémoire, right, where we have our everyday memory through our communities, and because of the speeding up of history, because people experience so much in one lifetime, that kind of shifts to, we now need lieu de mémoire, right, a sort of institutionalization of memory narratives. And this is something that is driven by lots of developments during modernity, like colonization, globalization, right, capitalist expansion, and so forth. But all of these things lead to this acceleration, and at the same time, that is when modern states that are behind, driving these developments, have developed lieu de mémoire as kind of tools of governance. So modern states still now have, whole departments devoted to, how can we sort of control memory narratives, and we've moved from this everyday memory culture to the institutionalization of sites of memory, which are not necessarily physical sites, right, but sort of condensed narratives that sort of, come up with a symbol for much more complicated historical developments. And of course, just to say, of course, in this action, we are still cognizant of those everyday memory cultures and don't think they've disappeared, but it's something that's kind of been marginalized in the field. So Nora, pioneered this idea of sites of memory, and one of the things that I've argued is that even though memory studies has lots of complicated theories and tools to still look at everyday life, it's been quite dominant, right? Both in terms of our field, but also in terms of memory policy making. So we have a lot of, the government policies, or the way in which people talk about, recognition, for example, of different communities' historical experiences, is in terms of, okay, let's make a day of remembrance, or a site, a memorial, right? So it has a lot to do with recognition, with consent of the governed, with legitimacy of the state. So we've got this sort of, and this is one of the things that we argued when we applied for the cost action, what we want to do differently, is that we said memory studies focuses too much on these sort of events, sudden, spectacular events, big men in history, right, moments in time, particular places, and that we want to break that up and do this differently, going beyond a sense of eventfulness. So for a long time, memory politics, I would say, there was a sense that it was mostly a top-down process, that states were really the ones determining, who you put up on a pedestal, Now, I've together with lots of others, but recently there's been a lot of work on more grassroots memory activism. But we could say that at the moment we're seeing sort of also an acceleration in memory politics. So we have a sense, I don't know, if you think back to 2020 when we were mostly at home, even though we were all stuck, right? There was pretty much every day in the news there was a new statue being taken down, right? There was a huge mobilization around these kind of sites of memory. Now, maybe you will look back in 20 years when we study this with hindsight and think, okay, that was a huge shift in the nature of our memory politics because we had this huge wave of decommemorations. However, I would say that in a way this really illustrates how much memory revolves around this eventfulness and around particular sites. Because if you think about it, most of these mobilizations, if you take down a statue, the reaction was usually to put up a different statue, right? Replace a Confederate general with a black civil rights activist or something like that, right? So we might have sort of shifted the content of our mainstream memory narratives. There's another question, how much people buy into that, right? But we've really done something in terms of the content, but we haven't really shifted the frameworks in which we think about the past. And that might be an issue, right? Because if you tear down a Confederate general, you're not really referring much to the sort of slow violence that, for example, African Americans had to experience walking by that statue every day, being intimidated not to vote, and these kinds of things, and also to the extent to which these things are not over, right? The symbolic violence, of course, in many ways continues. So we're talking about an ongoing slow violence that is not really in the past, right? So thinking about sort of Michael Rothberg's work here in terms of how we're implicated in not dismantling the structures that sort of lie behind or that are symbolized by these memorials. So that sort of signals a disconnect between some of the tools that we still use to commemorate or that we use to study this and the slow past that we're interested in. The other big assumption in memory studies is that the past is maybe going to save us, right? If we just remember right, then we'll become more peaceful, more democratic, right? Something will happen that helps us in the future. And I'm not, I think it's an empirical question whether that's actually true, but I think many of us at least hope that it is to some extent true, right? Otherwise we wouldn't be studying this. Like, why does it matter to remember the past, right? So I think one of the questions for me is, if memory really is supposed to help us shape our present and our future, how do we do this with slow things? What's the politics that we need to put together in order for that to make a difference? And I think so that's not just an intellectual problem, it's a really practical problem. If you think about the environmental emergency, at least some parts of the environmental emergency still move so slowly that they can't, that they're not recognized necessarily in 24-hour news cycles or in election cycles. So right now in the UK, right, the environmental issue has, it's not one of the top topics. So it's a fundamental policy problem for us in how we recognize the slow.
Sorry, previous slide. Drivers of
individuals as drivers of. Hold on. What does it say? As drivers of history. Yeah, sorry that when you transfer a PowerPoint, it sometimes gets a bit messed up. So this is kind of my initial take, and I'm going to try to sort of illustrate it now with a case study, right, to make it a little more interesting from one of my research areas. So the first thing is to compare, to illustrate this problem of slowness by comparing how we think about climate change versus biodiversity loss, which are, as you probably all know, biodiversity loss and climate change can't really be separated, right? They're absolutely closely linked. But if you look at how climate change is reported on, for example, how the UN conferences on climate change, how much media attention they get versus the biodiversity UN conferences, is vastly different, right? So these two issues in the public mind are different categories. So climate change, it's something that I often use when I explain to someone who has no idea about memory what we're doing in this slow memory action. So it's a development that's been going on for a long, long time, thousands of years at least. We haven't really paid attention to it, and it's devastating, right? We need to do something about it, and it has an impact really far into the future. Oh, sorry, is it in the way? Oh. So the thing is, one of the reasons I think that we're now paying more attention to this compared to biodiversity loss is that climate change has become eventful, right? It's floods, fires, droughts, right? Things on the news all the time. So it's quite hard to ignore at this point, even if you are not paying that much attention, especially if it's in your area, right? If it's your street being flooded, it's hard to ignore. So it's become eventful, even from a human perspective, right? Even from this very short temporality that we tend to use. Biodiversity loss, and what scientists refer to as a sixth extinction event, which we're currently in, even though there's debate about whether we should call this sixth extinction, but I won't go into that now. That's quite different, right? It's much less sort of on the surface. You can still ignore that there aren't as much insects or bees, or that a certain ecosystem is not the way it used to be, right? It's quite easy to not think about that. However, biodiversity is really an interesting thing to think about from the slow memory perspective. First of all, it's a fundamental process, right? The sort of cycle of extinction and evolution is something that's always going on in the background. So that's something we care about in this action, right? Even if we weren't in an extinction phase, a mass extinction rather, there's always extinctions going on. So it's a process that we, as humans, should think about. The other thing is that thinking about mass extinction events takes us into deep time, right? Because the last one was when the dinosaurs went extinct. So it's really something that if you start thinking about it, it helps you sort of wrap your head around that. And it's something that can be found in the fossil record, right? Something where memory is sort of set into stone. So then the sixth mass extinction, if we think about this as a slow past to consider, right? It's not actually that long ago that this began. And I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of the kind of historical developments that we're interested in this action are something that have to do with the rise of the modern state, with modernity, with capitalism, right? So I'll tell you a little bit more about the other things that I'm studying, but they're all kind of things that kind of started around the 18th, 19th century, depending on when you want to, there are debates about when you want to put the starting date. So biodiversity loss really picks up with the age of imperialism, with the age of exploration, and it's been on a crazy upward turn since the middle of the 20th century. So this is a crazy fast process if you think about geological time, right? Just in a few generations, it is extremely, extremely fast, this development. Again, though, we're not really paying a lot of attention compared to climate change. And this is kind of my main question for the research that I'll report on now a little bit, which is that this is, fundamental process. We're not really paying a lot of attention sort of on a broad societal level. So how do we deal with it in terms of cultural memory? What does cultural memory do with this topic? Oops, I had another thing about mass extinctions there. I forgot to keep track of time, so you're going to have to tell me a little bit how much.
We have 15 more minutes till 11.
Okay. That's till 11. How long have I been talking? I'm wondering if I should even go into the.
About 20 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'll try to give you a sort of quick rundown of this research, and then we can talk more about it in Q&A. So the first thing I was sort of thinking about is, so how do we, broadly in society, think about extinction? What do normal people know about this? And of course, one of the places that pretty much everyone goes with their kids or as kids is natural history museums, right? And that, I would say, is sort of the central place where there's a culture, what I call the culture of extinction, memory culture of extinction. So these places, commemorate a lot of extinct species, but they usually commemorate it as individual species. So, you all know about the dodo. It's kind of an icon, right? Or the thylacine, right? The Tasmanian tiger. So they're usually sort of fetishizing these individual creatures, even to the point that you can buy T-shirts and things. And it's quite a big commercial operation. What they don't really do is to talk about the broader role that these museums have played in the very extinction of the animals that they're commemorating, right? Because these museums are all part of the rise of the field of natural science. Very much the collecting drive behind these museums was scientists going out, into the foreign world and finding exotic creatures, and thereby really contributing to their extinction, right? To their overhunting or changing of habitats and so on that led to their extinction. So, and it's not coincidental, right, that these museums, they rose during the rise of the modern state and the era of the sort of hyper era of national memory institutions, right? All modern states have these big natural history museums, and it's very much part of this culture of monument building and musealization and taking the exotic and putting it on display. So very much part of, imperialism and colonialism. So in a way, this individualistic approach that they take, right, just focusing on these particular species, makes a lot of sense because it means they don't have to talk about their own responsibility in this process. But I don't want to be black and white about it. I think there's also another dimension, which is that a lot of the people who today work at these museums see themselves as environmental activists, right? And they are cognizant of their role in informing the public about climate change and biodiversity loss. And so this idea of like building an emotional connections to these species that we've lost or that are endangered is, an important mechanism that's familiar from memory culture, right? That you want to have this emotional, that, it's almost like a mourning that you do when you go to these museums. And often they have parts, some pretty small sometimes, but some way of, okay, what can you do, right? How should you recycle or whatever, like comes at the end of the gallery. And this is what Ursula Heise, she has a book called Imagining Extinction, that she refers to this as a proxy logic. So you build a relationship with this particular animal, but they really represent something much broader. And that's what Rob Nixon also talks about, right? That these environmental problems have a problem of representation, right? It's really hard to make a slow past, matter in somebody's mind. And a way to do that is to use these individual species. Now, I won't have enough time to really go through this in detail, but I've been studying a really interesting project at the south of England, South Coast, which some of you, this is where we had our first cost action conference in Portland. So it's a little island on the Jurassic Coast. It's called the Jurassic Coast because of the importance in terms of geological, the science of geology, really. And that is Seb Brook. So he is the founder of this project. And in 2007, he had this idea of, that's where the memorial is going to be, of building a very monumental monument, something impressive that would signify, that would mourn the species that have already gone extinct according to the IUCN Red List. So it's a spiral structure. I think I have another picture of it there somewhere. No. It's a spiral structure that carves into stone the species that have already gone extinct, and kind of marks their importance. And it's a very traditional idea, right? This memorial was designed by a famous architect. It's almost like carving the names of the fallen into the rock, right? It's very, very conventional, but it's trying to take this very slow development for us, right? Obviously, as I said, it's very fast in geological terms, and something that is unsighted, that's taking place all across the world, and giving it a place and giving it an emotional kind of place to mourn. Now, Portland is interesting because it's for hundreds of years it's been a place where Portland stone is quarried. Portland stone is very conventional for using in gravestones, and so the traditional idea of mourning your dead, but also it's been used for much of downtown London, because after the Great Fire of London they had to rebuild it, and that was the stone that was in at the time. But also the cladding on the UN headquarters in New York City. So you find Portland stone all over the world just because it was so in, and the particular kind of Portland stone has a lot of fossils in it. So it's actually what led to the discovery of the concept of extinction, right? Because there were these ammonites in the rock that they were like, well, where's this creature? It doesn't, it's not on the earth anymore. So that's how they figured out that extinction was a thing. So here you can see how this memorial is supposed to look inside. And again, I'm whizzing through this a little bit, but the puzzle for me, and why I'm interested in the politics surrounding this this memorial, is that even though it's had amazing amount of support, so Prince Philip, late Prince Philip, was the royal patron, which in the UK, that's a big deal, right? And they actually had several fundraising dinners at Buckingham Palace. They had E.O. Wilson, who's one of the most famous biologists, was a big supporter. The UN General Assembly highlighted it. I actually got to go to the UN Biodiversity Conference a couple years ago with this project. So it's had a lot of support, and yet it's not been able to get enough funding to be built. And my question is kind of why, right? If people were to recognize that this is a really important thing that we need to care about, why is it that it's so hard to get this off the ground? And I think part of the reason is, what I talked about is it's just still pretty abstract for most people. It doesn't seem like a main concern. But the other thing is that people are, concerned with how gloomy this is. So it's a memorial that, just shows what's already gone. And it's kind of depressing, right? Why would you want that on your island? So that's what some of the potential funders have said. So there's been a big shift now. And the reason I put up that this is the Eden Project in Cornwall, which is a very, very successful environmental theme park almost, is a place where you go to have fun. It's not, you don't go there because you want to learn about climate change. You go to have fun. And they call it education by stealth. So you go because you want to have a great day out, and then you find out about climate change while you're there. So that is now the concept that the Memo Project is going with. They've now partnered with Eden. They're now called Eden Portland. And the idea is to use the underground. The whole island has lots of mine spaces, and they're using one of the old mines to have a multimedia experience underground that tells you about biodiversity and about deep time. So I've now been to the mine a few times, and it's a really different experience, right? You're not going in there thinking, where are all these creatures or whatever. You go in and think, like the mine manager used to say, you go in and you're like, oh, it's kind of scary going into the space, right? There's a giant crack on the ceiling, and somebody inevitably asks, like, is that safe? Like, is it going to crack? And he's like, no, that's been there since that's like from the Pyrenees being thrown up. That's where the crack comes in. So it's completely stable. That's how old it is. So it gives you some sense of deep time. And so that's kind of what I'm wondering, whether that might be a different kind of argument, right? It revolves around the jobs that this project's going to create, the number of tourists it's going to get. They're not really talking about memory anymore, about remembering extinct species. It's all about the local, benefits, essentially. But what I think might happen, and again, it's not been built yet, and now we have a new government very soon, hopefully, fingers crossed. So we don't know what's going to happen because of that. But the idea is to build this this first stage underground, which won't be very expensive. That's what the mine looks like today. And then from the proceeds of that first stage to then build the memorial on site. So the memorial is still gonna, it's still in the plan. And I think it might be kind of memory by stealth, right? You come there not to mourn the species, you come there to have a fun day out on this island, but then you're gonna get these messages of extinct species. Now, that was a very fast summary, and I probably still haven't left enough time. I just wanted to close with a couple of other thoughts. So obviously this is just one case study where, I've looked, if I had more time, I would tell you more about the political economy and the politics surrounding that. But basically, my take on this is kind of that, slow memory matters, not just sort of the big questions of deep time and, temporality, but how this interacts with sort of contemporary human struggles and experience, right? So how does this matter to us in the present? And the real challenge, again, is to bridge the gap between these sort of slow-moving, gradual, unsighted developments and the meaning-making and economic and social practices that we have in the present to sort of grasp them with. And so I've been also studying some other arenas, so especially memory activism around family separation policies and institutional child abuse, which again is something that goes back to the 19th century. Modern state is really crucial to it, but that's a very different kind of case study where I've tried to apply these ideas. And also, and this is maybe what I'll end with, is that in the action, when we proposed it, we also very much stress that we want to not study just the bad things, but also the good, the gradual developments that have been positive, right? That we want to remember and celebrate. So, for example, the slow evolution of the democratic franchise is another case study. So I can talk about this more individually, but yes, that's for now my spiel. And do we have any time or? Sorry. Thank you. Sorry, I hope that was not too rushed.
Well, I think we can steal a few minutes from the break, right? So if you want to.
Yeah, if there are any questions or comments.
Can I ask more contextual questions?
Sure.
Probably all have or assumptions required that the organizing team decide to talk about small memory in Serbia and Belgrade. That's the issue here.
So I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, why we are here in Belgrade in Serbia to talk about.
Well, that probably Orly is better. I mean, I think.
Just on the content side.
Well, I think essentially you could go anywhere and find slow memory things to talk about. But of course, there are some places, that are particularly interesting and kind of alive with things that are happening right now, but also that we have great people to organize meetings.
Well, do you want me to on now?
Yeah, I think you turn it off now.